The Trireme, premier warship of the Mediterranean. The Trireme is a warship with a long and storied history of service across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea throughout the classical period. The wooden warship was mass-produced by the Greek and Phoenician civilized cities across the Mediterranean for war and for maritime operations. First produced, perhaps, sometimes around the 7th century BC, the date is disputed, a lot. The 300-year classical service saw the warship spread in common usage across the Mediterranean and Black Seas, although it would reach its developmental peak during the 5th century BC. The origin of the ship is unfortunately a mystery. Thucydides says that they were first used by Syracuse, just before the Persian Wars and the death of Darius. However, a lot of historians quote Corinth as being the first to build triremes in the 7th century. By the 5th century BC, most Hellenic and Phoenician territories were using triremes, though. The confusion of their use is partially due to multiple ships bearing the name trireme at the same time, and minor design differences which could be observed. The Eastern Romans, for example, would use ships named triremes right up to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Despite minor differences and changes in construction techniques, they were all ships of the same general design lineage and bore the same name. All were powered by 3 banks of rowers, and all were equipped with sails for open water use. For armament, the trireme was equipped with a large bronze battering ram, common on all warships of the era. The idea was that the rowers would bring the ship up to ramming speed and cleave an enemy warship in half. It also carried a marine contingent for, boarding actions and amphibious landings. Herodotus records that triremes carried between 10 to 30 marines, split between archers and hoplites, although Herodotus is sometimes sketchy on data. These marines also acted as recovery personnel, using ropes and grappling hooks to pull damaged ships to shore. Triremes were also lacking in cargo space, with most of the bulk being taken up with space for the rowers, and barrels of drinking water. To save on the weight, triremes only carried drinking water for the crews, and depended on docking at coastal towns every night or frequently enough for provisions. That made them a generally short-range ship dependent on local allies or just friendly ports to sustain their operations. Minor design differences were present across the Mediterranean and everyone who used it. Each user put their own spin on the platform. Greek triremes, for example, were generally heavier built than their Persian counterparts and more durable. The Persians, or Achaemenids technically, built triremes that were faster but lighter in combat. The most unusual ones, that I could find anyway, were the Syracusan triremes. Thucydides says that they were capable of making head-on attacks against Greek vessels, but that unusual capability isn't really mentioned anywhere else, or even by Thucydides later in his accounts. So it might be fictional, or just a legend brought back from the few survivors of the Syracusan expedition. The most famous use of the trireme was its service in the Persian Wars and the Great Peloponnesian War. Both the Hellenic states and the Persian states would use triremes as their frontline warship for the conflict. During the battles, it was between ships of the same type, triremes on triremes, although the minor design differences and tactical differences would decide many of the battles. At Artemisium, a smaller Hellenic trireme squadron was able to delay the massive Persian armada for days. The heavy Greek triremes were more suitable to combat in the narrow straits of the Aegean, and contact with the allied island of Euboea, the breadbasques of Greece, at that point, gave the Hellenics an untroubled supply situation. Details about the battle are sparse, unfortunately, but it cemented that the Hellenic ships were better for the narrow strait fighting which would, define the war, and was best for the Greek archipelago. Despite good positioning, the Hellenics did retreat after several hard days of inconclusive fighting, let's say. And that was when the detachment at Thermopylae was annihilated. The Battle of Salamis was arguably the high watermark of the Trireme's combat service. It was also probably the largest battle that they ever fought in. It was the battle between the Hellenic states and the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and arguably, depending on who you ask, is one of the most significant battles in just history in general. The Hellenic fleet was made up mainly of triremes from the traditional maritime powers of Greece: Athens, Corinth, Megara, Aegina, and Chalcis. The alliance was an uneasy one, and the Corinthians and the Athenians were in a dispute over the leadership, and Aegina was only a few months out of a fairly significant war with Athens. Definitely a shaky alliance. Despite their differences, the Greeks and the Persians met for battle. The date isn't clear, unfortunately, and neither of the numbers, but generally, it was somewhere over 300 Hellenic triremes, and the Persians' estimates are very difficult to come by, and Herodotus' numbers are always a bit shaky, but the conservative estimate of 400 ships still massively outnumbered the Greek fleet, and the absolute highest estimates of 1,200 Persian triremes still massively outnumbered the Greeks. In the narrow Salamis Strait, the heavier Greek ships were able to annihilate the faster and lighter Persian ships. With no room to maneuver, the Greeks had a very large advantage, although the Persians did also have Greek ships among their number, mainly from the Dorian states which Medized. Despite the staggering victory against the Persians, the Greeks wouldn't really unify at that sense until Alexander again. The maritime powers of Greece split apart and found themselves at odds during the Great Peloponnesian War. The following war was categorized mainly by numerous smaller skirmishes between numerous squadrons, and while there were fleet battles with hundreds of ships involved, it was mostly attritional warfare, which the very large and expensive triremes weren't suited for, and the populations of the age couldn't sustain. Within a century of Salamis, the trireme would be augmented and later replaced by the larger quadriremes and quinquiremes. The Hellenistic kingdoms that existed after the Macedonian conquest of Persia would also build enormous polyremes, although scant is known about these ships, and they disappeared just as quickly as they showed up. Despite their service largely ending in the century after Salamis and the Great Peloponnesian War, the lineage of the trireme would continue, with the Eastern Romans and even the Western Romans, until their collapse, using trireme lineage ships. Some sources even named several Eastern Roman ships as triremes, hence the name confusion. The name would even continue somewhere into the early modern period, with some of the war galleys continuing to bear the name. The trireme and its lineage of design is probably the single most iconic ship in Mediterranean history, and definitely the most significant for Mediterranean history. It's why the trireme was the premier warship of the Mediterranean.